Isabel's eyes scanned the dim kitchen as she filled her mother's chipped teacup with water, her heart heavy with an aching sense of duty. She'd made peace, or so she told herself, with the constant barbs that came from Eleanor, her mother, an aging widow who had lost her charm and softened edges with the passing of Isabel's father. Eleanor had always preferred Abigail, the younger sister who had been gifted with an easy charm, marrying young and building what appeared to be a perfect life. But for Isabel, who stayed behind, who set aside dreams of her own to ensure her mother had companionship and support, there was nothing but faint praise and nagging criticisms. And now, the unthinkable had happened. Eleanor had ordered Isabel to leave, to make way for Abigail and her husband Thomas. They were struggling, her mother had insisted. They needed help, a place to land on their feet. Isabel's heart twisted with a mix of betrayal and resignation. She'd known, perhaps always, that no matter what she did, her mother's heart belonged to Abigail. "Isabel, you're practical, yes, but you've always been so bland," Eleanor had said that morning. "You'd be much better off on your own. You don't need me the way Abigail does." With a slow, steady hand, Isabel finished making her mother's tea. Setting it on the counter, she took one last look at the home she had poured so much of her life into, her mind lingering on the faded wallpaper she had chosen herself, the small, cozy kitchen where she'd prepared meals when her mother was too weak to cook. She had tried to leave once before, but had returned out of a sense of responsibility, a need to protect the only parent she had left. Now she wondered, with a pang of clarity, if leaving had been her true calling all along. The following week, as she packed her things into boxes, Isabel overheard the voices she dreaded to hear, the sounds of her mother laughing, her younger sister's sweetly persuasive tones drifting through the hall. Isabel continued packing, fingers tightening around the dusty memento she had once cherished, but her pulse quickened at the words she could not help but hear. "Mom, it's just been so hard," Abigail said, her voice tinged with helplessness that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "Thomas and I are at the end of our rope. We had no other option but to come to you." Eleanor's soft coos of sympathy echoed through the house. Isabel gritted her teeth, trying to block out the conversation that laid bare her sister's strategy, a calculated mix of pity and pleading that Eleanor had always fallen for. Only now, the stakes were different. Her sister and husband weren't just staying for a night or two, they were moving in, pushing Isabel out of her own life. But as she continued packing, her mind returned to the one thing she hadn't dared to mention to her mother: the debt Abigail and Thomas had racked up over the years. Rumors had reached Isabel through town whispers: gambling debts, failed business ventures, the so-called bad luck that seemed to shadow her sister and her husband wherever they went. Her mother's love might blind her, but Isabel's mind was clear. She'd seen too much of life to fall for empty words and tears. And so, with one last glance at her family's disintegrating sanctuary, Isabel packed the final box and prepared to leave behind everything she had once thought of as home. It was a humid evening when Isabel confronted her sister and mother for her belongings in the modest company apartment, but the weight of unspoken words pressed on her too heavily to ignore. She returned to the house, finding her mother and sister sitting together in the living room, their laughter a hollow, mocking echo of what family should have been. Taking a deep breath, Isabel stepped inside, her presence breaking the false sense of comfort that Abigail and Eleanor had cocooned themselves in. Abigail looked up, her expression sliding quickly from surprise to an almost smug satisfaction. "Well, look who's here," she sneered, crossing her arms. "Shouldn't you be off starting your new life, Isabel?" Isabel took a step forward, her voice quiet but steady. "I came back to get what's mine. The things I paid for with my own money, the furniture, the appliances. They're coming with me." Her mother gasped, her face clouding with irritation. "Isabel, don't be ridiculous. You know your sister and Thomas need those things far more than you do. You're being selfish." "Selfish?" Isabel's voice trembled as years of pent-up frustration spilled over. "I've spent half my life here, working, sacrificing my dreams, taking care of you, while Abigail was off living her own life. And now, you're asking me to walk away and leave everything I've earned so that she can, what? So she can pick up where she left off, pretending she's the dutiful daughter." Abigail smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, Isabel, you've always taken yourself far too seriously. The truth is, Thomas and I need the space more than you ever did. And frankly, we need the help. You don't want to leave us high and dry, do you?" It was then that Isabel noticed the telltale flash of desperation in Abigail's eyes, the faint tremor in her voice. She realized with a sudden stark clarity that Abigail's need was not for family, it was financial. She saw the real motive behind her sister's return, and suddenly, the anger that had fueled her all these years began to cool, replaced by a calm, unshakable resolve. "Is that why you're here, Abigail?" Isabel asked, her gaze unwavering. "Because you and Thomas need money. Are you hoping for a handout from Mom?" Eleanor's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing her features. "What are you saying, Isabel?" "I'm saying that Abigail's here because she's run out of options," Isabel replied. "She and Thomas are buried in debt, and they're hoping you'll save them. It was never about family, Mom. It was about what they could get from you." Abigail's face twisted in fury. "You don't know what you're talking about," she spat, her voice barely controlled. But Eleanor looked at her younger daughter, a glimmer of realization dawning in her eyes. "Isabel, is that true? Are you in trouble, Abigail?" For the first time, Abigail's confident mask slipped. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to fail her, and she fell silent, her gaze darting to the floor. The room was thick with tension, each second stretching out in painful silence. Finally, Eleanor turned to Isabel, her face a mixture of shame and regret. "Isabel, I didn't know." But Isabel shook her head, her heart resolute. "It doesn't matter anymore, Mom. You made your choice. I'm done being the one who's always expected to sacrifice." Without another word, Isabel turned and left. This time for good, her heart lighter than it had felt in years. As the weeks passed, Isabel settled into her new apartment, finding solace in her quiet, unencumbered life. She haunted by the weight of unfulfilled expectations or the constant demand for her mother's approval. Instead, Isabel filled her days with small, joyful routines, arranging her modest belongings in her own way, reading books she'd put off for years, and allowing herself to imagine a future that was entirely her own. For the first time, she found herself laughing freely, with no one to judge her choices. She reconnected with old friends, attended evening classes at a local community center, and discovered a love for painting. She felt a warmth of belonging that had always been missing, an acceptance that seemed to bloom from within. But the echoes of her family's discontent followed her in subtle ways. She occasionally received brief, pointed messages from her mother, thinly veiled hints of hardship and struggle. Eleanor never asked directly for help, but the words between the lines were clear. Each time, Isabel considered her response carefully, allowing herself to feel sympathy but resisting the pull of guilt that had once controlled her. She had left that life behind, and she would not go back. One evening, as she returned home, Isabel was surprised to find Abigail waiting for her at her doorstep. Dressed in last year's fashion, her hair less perfectly styled than Isabel remembered, Abigail looked smaller, diminished somehow. She managed a weak smile. "I thought you'd have time for your little sister," Abigail murmured, her voice stripped of its usual bravado. Isabel opened her door but didn't invite Abigail inside. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, and simply waited. Abigail hesitated, then sighed. "Things have been hard. Thomas and I, well, we've had to sell the house. We couldn't keep up with the payments, and Mom, well, she's struggling too." Isabel's heart ached with a familiar, bittersweet sadness, but she held her ground, her voice steady. "I'm sorry to hear that, Abigail. But this is exactly what I tried to warn you about. You could have chosen another path, both of you could have. You had chances." Abigail's shoulders slumped. "I know, Isabel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know I messed up. I thought I could fix everything by coming home. I thought if I could just get Mom to help us." Isabel took a deep breath, steadying herself against the pull of old wounds. "You didn't come home for Mom, Abigail. You came for yourself. And I can't blame you for that. But it's not my job to clean up after you anymore." For the first time, Abigail looked truly vulnerable, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I don't know what to do, Isabel. I thought you'd be the one person who'd understand." A part of Isabel longed to reach out, to comfort her sister and let her in, but she remembered the years of sacrifices, the countless times she'd been dismissed and belittled. This was not her burden to bear anymore. "Maybe it's time you start taking responsibility, Abigail," Isabel said gently, though her words carried a firm edge. "For once, you'll have to figure this out on your own." Abigail nodded slowly, her face crumpling as the reality set in. She turned to leave, and for a moment, Isabel felt the ghost of regret for the family they could have been, for the bond that might have existed in another life. But as Abigail disappeared into the night, Isabel knew she had made the right choice. Months turned into years, and Isabel's life became a testament to her resilience. She blossomed in her newfound freedom, finding love in small, unexpected places a garden she planted in the community park, a volunteer project she led at the local library, the friendship she nurtured with people who valued her for who she was. Her family's absence remained a quiet ache, but she learned to live with it, to cherish the peace that her hard-won independence had brought her. She heard, through occasional town gossip, that her mother and sister had moved to a smaller home in a distant suburb, and while she felt a pang of sympathy, it was tempered by the knowledge that she had given them all she could, and then some. Isabel had chosen herself, for the first time, and in doing so, she had found the life she'd been denied for so long. She would never forget the years spent in the shadows, but now she stood in the light, radiant and whole, finally at peace. In the end, she realized the love she had sought from others could only come from within, and that was a love she would carry forward, forever unbreakable. So if you love this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.